Welcome everybody online to Data Innovation Summit 2018. We're here live with Jean-Michel Franco from Talend, and we're going to be talking about GDPR, everyone's favorite subject. Let's dive straight into it. Welcome. Can you please tell us a bit about yourself and how you work with GDPR and how it's relevant to what you do?
Yeah, so I'm working at Talend, a company that is specializing in data management, data integration. And within Talend, I'm in charge of data governance products. And so, of course, this data privacy thing came by a kind of storm since a couple of months. And so I'm in charge of both creating the offers, but also getting the customer on board with this topic.
Right. What kind of customers have started earliest getting ready for GDPR?
I think the most advanced and the one that are getting faster are the companies that knew already what was data governance, like the banks. So they had rules like BCBS or solvency or whatever. So they had to establish a principle to get control over the data.
Right.
And so those were ahead because they had already the organization. They knew a little bit how to establish the different mechanism to really control the data.
Right.
So the biggest one, and financial services, healthcare, life science, companies like heavily regulated industries.
So what you're saying is there have been regulations in the past that people have had to comply with. And what is GDPR then? And what does it bring that's new that people need to comply with? What does it change?
So what is changed first, GDPR, it goes across all industries. So every company now have a regulation that mandates them to take control over their data, because it's all about that. I have personal data, it's not mine, it's the data from my customer or from my employee, and I need to establish the control to make sure that this data is used for purpose. And this is really an accountability principle. This is pretty different from the previous law. In the previous law, the regulator, like your Sweden or France, had to prove that the company was not complying with the regulation.
Right.
Now it's the opposite. As a company, you need to be accountable of all your data that you have about your people. So I think this is a main change, this accountability principle.
So generally speaking, many of the principles are the same. It's just now that the accountability has shifted from one side to the other.
Yeah, the principles goes deeper in the fact that the consumer or the data subjects, as is stated in the law, has now control over this data and has to be forgotten. So there are more principles, but yeah, the main change is accountability. And this is a big difference in how Europe perceives it and other countries, this principle of accountability, which I think is very important. And from a personal people perspective, I think it's much better.
Right. So what would you say are the top 5 most difficult things for becoming GDPR compliant now?
So I think that GDPR is about getting control over your data, so you need to get hands-on. And in particular, there are 5 things. First, you need to know where is your personal data. And so the data spans everywhere. We are more and more in a big data mindset where you take data, you capture data before you even know what's in it. And then you do schema on read and things like that to understand what is in it.
Right.
So that's getting difficult to know exactly where all the personal data is.
Right.
Sometimes it's even difficult to define what is personal data. So if my car is connected, and the car belongs to me, then all the connected, the IoT can become personal data. So you need to define, and you need exactly to capture this personal data and to know where it is on a continuous basis. So that's the reason why that is a challenge, is that generally company, when they see GDPR, they do some paperwork. They bring all the people and they say, okay, I have personal data in this system, and they put it on Excel, but then the system evolves. And then you don't know anymore where is your data. So that's the first principle.
All right.
Second principle, it's linked, is you need also to know the location, because we are in a cloud age, and sometimes you don't know where your data reside. Maybe it's a US server, maybe it's in Sweden. Now for GDPR and privacy, you need to know exactly where this data is. If it's exported, you need to have some rules on how you export data. So that has a cloud impact.
Right.
So there's the data is on the cloud and I don't know where it is. You need to know.
Right.
Third is consent.
Right.
So you need to capture consents across your application, and you need to track and trace the consent. So when a customer asks you, tell you, I never gave you the consent to receive emails, or I never gave you consent to get my health information for profiling or whatever. So you need to be able to prove and to manage the opt-in, the opt-outs on a global basis. It's not siloed like it used to be. So that's 3. And then I would say 4 and 5 are the right of the data subjects, like the right to be forgotten, or the right of data portability, which means if I'm a frequent flyer in my airplane company, I want to ask all the data that they have about me so that I was a frequent flyer. And then I can maybe switch to another company and become a frequent flyer sooner.
Right.
So that
ties back to points 1 and 3 that you said, where you, in order to be able to forget somebody, you have to, one, define what is personal about that person, right? And then also check whether you've had consent or anything for tracking their things, so that when a person asks for their data to be erased, you need to know what is their data to begin with.
Yeah, you really need to have this 360-degree view that all companies are a little bit struggling to have, because there's always a new system that is siloed and that is not connected. Here you have this privacy by design principle that say, I need to reconcile all this information from scratch, because when I have personal data, I need to understand the risk, I need to understand how it can relate to other information, etc.
Did you have a point 5?
Yeah, for point 5. So, 4 was data portability.
Okay.
And 5 was the right to be forgotten.
Okay, portability.
Right to be forgotten is the most difficult, because it's not just only what we do in data warehouse, reconciling data, but it's also closing the feedback loop.
Yeah.
So to tap in the source data back.
Yeah.
So very difficult in terms of complexity.
I've personally experienced situations where you're designing a database and you're designing it for speed and efficiency, and that's not necessarily what's best for being able to pick out individual records of an individual. So I can see how the two might be at odds when you're designing technology for it to work well. But you still need to be able to pull out one record out of this giant sea of data.
Yeah, so one example is the data lake design generally relies on files.
Right.
And doing a record level deletion on a file is very tricky. So you need to design the system, to have that in mind when you design the system. And for existing system, it might be tricky.
Okay. Well, let's go back to point number 1 that I think is interesting. What is personal data? So this is something that all banks and everybody needs to spend some time doing. I think maybe writing a list for themselves. This is what we consider to be personal data in their specific domain. And you gave a good example of connected cars. And you might think, well, a car is a car. It's not a person, so it's not personal data. But a car is always parked at a person's house, and a car always drives, to their work, and that it could very easily become personal data. And also, I've seen some recent research where you can do text analysis, and people write in a very unique way. So a book review might not be personal data, but then again, it might be. So how should companies approach this when it's not clear what is personal data or not?
So first they need to create an inventory, and then it might become a legal thing. Okay, is this data, specific data, personal or not? Is this not the data, but the correlation, like you take in words? It can be an assembly of words that is getting personal or thing like that. So you need to define your what is called your critical data elements, and then find out if it should be considered as personal data or not. And of course, the impact is significant because personal data means some control, so there is cost in managing personal data. And a good example is all the analytics, the data warehouse. Sometimes you may think that it's not mandated to have personal data here because those systems are made to be accessed by a huge range of people for different use cases. So it might be important to anonymize from start so that you can get out of this regulation if the purpose is not clear. Or So I think it's better to act that way and to say, okay, when I have personal data, I have a purpose and the purpose is clear. And then I can manage the system according to that purpose in a kind of fair way. But if I don't know in the beginning if it's a borderline, then maybe I should take them out definitively and solve the principle instead of maintaining the ambiguity.
Right. Have you seen any companies forming maybe consortiums or groups to try and discuss this? I can imagine it would be beneficial for banks or others to try and talk to each other and see what's your interpretation and how are you, what do you regard personal data and that kind of thing?
Yeah, I see also,
is that a trend you've been seeing? Or?
I've seen also initiatives of company helping to make the data, so to take the responsibility out of the personal data. So it's called building some kind of reverse CRM system where the customer owns his data, and when he wants to share, then he comes, he opts in, he brings his data and maybe he can take that out. So if you're a bank, look at retail, by the way, it happened already. Many retailers avoid to keep your credit card info. They work with consortium that holds the credit card, and so they make things to avoid to keep the credit card into their systems. So that's the kind of systems I see. So how can I take the personal data out of my system and make sure that it's the customer or the data subject that comes with their personal data when it's appropriate. Like a passport, when you provide your passports to cross the borders. But it's you that gives the data.
You keep it in most cases,
Yeah.
unless you're in trouble.
Yeah.
But okay, well, what about consent? And how does that tie into companies that would like to do research and see if there's anything interesting to be done with the data? How should companies be approaching that? Because there's lots of innovation that can be done and neat services that could be offered to the customers potentially, even with mundane data such as Netflix's viewing habits. They might want to study that data and see if there's any other neat kind of service they could provide their movie watchers. How should companies be approaching that kind of explorative analytics?
So I think consent should be very explicit. When you ask consent for the customer, I think your customer needs to understand why. And if you look at, so companies do that pretty well is like Amazon. When you give your consent, and generally they explain you why they do a recommendation and things like that. So you give data. It can be very private data, but you understand why. And you probably guess that Amazon won't sell your personal data to other company because it's also very critical to the relationship you have with them. And so that's a kind of fair approach to personal data. On the opposite, you have a system like the one that is on the headlines currently is this Cambridge Analytica story, where people were giving opt-ins for an application that was looking at their psychological profile. But then this information were used for campaigns and something else. And that's where the trick is. And I think that's the danger for company when they think about that is to say, if I take personal data and I try to use it for other purposes, then there's a kind of trust mechanism with the customer that might be broken.
I see. Well, you gave the example of Amazon. And how about recommendation engines. There's one particular aspect of GDPR which we were talking about earlier before the show started, which is that you need to be able to explain how algorithms came to a certain decision.
Yeah.
I think the scenario most people are envisioning is being denied a loan or getting a certain premium for, well, let's take that. That's a good example. Getting a certain premium for car insurance, say. You have an algorithm that calculates that premium based on not 5 variables, but naive variables such as age, sex, and other things, but perhaps thousands of variables that are all very important. And it's because the domain of knowing whether somebody will crash or not is quite complicated. It involves, who knows, your driving style, what the weather is like, what your commute is like, and so on. Is it reasonable to expect that, in your opinion, personal opinion, is it reasonable to expect that we should be able to explain such a complicated problem domain? Because it seems to me that the problem, or the opaqueness, the fact that you can't explain perhaps in all scenarios why it made a certain suggestion, is not due to that the machine learning model is hard to interpret, but rather the problem domain is so complicated that it's hard to explain. It's like a doctor trying to explain to a patient why they're sick. So is it reasonable to expect that all these things should be explainable in all circumstances?
So this is very difficult. This is a big challenge, but I think it is crucial that we came to an understanding of that. And you see, there are more and more publications. Like there's a book that is called "Weapons of Mass Destruction."
Yes.
I don't know if you heard of this.
Yes, it's popular.
And this book explained the risks of applying mathematics when you summarize and you don't understand what is happening behind, and then you can. I think a data scientist, his role is to understand what's behind the algorithm. And we need to improve that, because we know that sometimes it's very difficult to understand when I make a Google query, the order of the response are that way. It's become very difficult, but we need to bring transparency between the algorithm. There's a joke you might know. There's a famous statistician who says, I believe in God, the other bring data. But then the statistician must ensure that the data is trusted and is because otherwise his principle doesn't work. So I think that it's a big challenge for data scientists, but they need to bring the transparency. Otherwise, maybe we will have some viruses in the algorithm, so people trying to inject fake data to influence decisions. There'll be a lot of things like that. And only if you can explain that, you can govern and counter that.
That seems like a legitimate concern, that somebody might want to corrupt models or take advantage of them, that kind of thing, in which case accountability is quite important. For instance, if a model starts affecting elections or something of that sort.
Or something like that. Or diesel emissions. This is a good example. We should have mechanism that shows that these results of diesel emission were totally not real. So data science should help us to find those kind of bias and say, okay, something is happening there. So someone is trying to cheat the system of metrics. And so I think this is crucial over the time, because we see more and more use of this fake data.
All right. We were speaking before about future technologies, and one of our delegates, viewers here, has asked the question: how will foreign companies comply to European GDPR? So GDPR is specifically a European thing, and many companies are international, Swedish companies or European companies here, and also American companies that want to do business with European companies. How do they have to comply with GDPR?
They do. There is no difference. When you capture data from European citizen, then you need to comply with GDPR. So I think that there's a gap for them, because my role is global, and I see that in North America, companies are just discovering those kind of topics, the principles of opt-in. So they are far behind, I would say, but they have to apply. And I think that they'll have pressure, because I tend to say that GDPR is more than a regulation. GDPR is a customer relationship problem. So it's about bringing trust with your customers. And so surveys show that as a data subjects, you will ask your company for your data. You will ask for data portability. You will ask for the right to be forgotten. And so all company will have to apply on that. And here it's not a regulation. It's a matter of relationship with your customer.
Right.
You know, if you ask your telco company and you don't get back your data, then maybe you leave them and go to other companies. So it's not a matter of regulation. It's a matter of customer relationship.
Right.
And that applies for everyone. So. And to make it clear, I think that the challenge for a foreign company is significant. And if we now take a step back, and if you're a European company, you need also to consider that there's not only GDPR. There are regulations in South Africa, in Canada, and more will blur across the world. And you need to establish a control to comply with all those regulations.
Right. So there are a lot of things that companies have already built using personal data and that type of information. Machine learning models that have been trained using personal data and other products that have been built on it. How should companies handle those kinds of products or those kind of machine learning models or other things that have been built on top of personal data?
So all the analytics has to be, I would say, proof checked against GDPR. I think one of the key skill is anonymization.
Right.
So company need to get skills on, because it's, if you are strong with anonymization, it's easy. You know, you have a data warehouse, then you say, okay, I have personal data, I shouldn't, then I just have to anonymize.
Right.
But you have to anonymize it the right way. Sometimes it might be a little tricky to make sure that by anonymizing, you're de-identifying the data.
Right.
So you need those skills. And I think the anonymization becomes a key skill for data scientists, for everyone who is involved in analytics, for existing and for new systems.
Let's focus on anonymization for just a second. It seems that there are, from the perspective of the data itself, that there are two ways to de-anonymize data. Let's say you have a data set that you think is protected and somebody gets a hold of it. You think it's anonymous. If it's not well anonymized, it's very simple to de-anonymize the entire data set. If it's well anonymized, but not entirely protected, you might, with great effort, be able to de-anonymize one record, but not figure out. So, for instance, if you have your data somewhere, it might be very difficult to look up precisely you in that data set that I've gotten a hold of, but I could potentially de-anonymize one person. These seems to be two different kinds of risk profiles where you can get a data set and de-anonymize everybody and look up one person immediately, or get a data set and potentially de-anonymize one point with great effort. Because I find in my personal experience that it's a little bit up to the skill of the data scientist how far you can take it and de-anonymize data. Nearly anything can be de-anonymized if you're, persistent enough. Does GDPR look at these two risk profiles in different ways, or is it all the same?
So GDPR is not very deep in how you need to do that. But of course, the anonymization can be an art. If you look at what happened in life science, for example,
good example.
The companies are acquiring some data to understand where their medicine works or what doesn't work. And those people that sell data have to anonymize so that you don't know which physician gave which prescription.
Right.
And so sometimes in some region there might be, 8 physicians in a very big landscape, and in other, just in one street or one block, there might be a lot. So they need to find the right aggregation, and they have elevated it up to a kind of science. And in some industry, company will have to do that. They will have to be very precise and in how they apply anonymization. And also, this is a continuous progress that I need to do, because the more we advance in big data, the more we can reconcile data. Like today, I know that some people prove that you can find out who is in a picture, even if the picture has been flowed or
Blurred.
blurred.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
So over time, the scientific progress makes re-anonymization, re-identification,
Yeah.
easier. And so maybe then you have to adjust your masking algorithm. So it might be
So it's a process rather
yeah.
than a now we are compliant.
Yeah, maybe it's part of data science, by the way.
Right.
How you personalize or your unpersonalized data.
How do you suspect it will play out in practice? Will companies be able to feel confident and say, now we know we are compliant? Or will it be that they are continuously trying to improve and that jurisprudence with the law will eventually show who's correct and who's not correct?
That's the second. This is a work in motion. There is GDPR. There is already a e-privacy regulation that is coming around in Europe. I studied the different regulation across the world, and if you look at Asia Pacific, a lot of rules are getting established. So you need to raise your bar of privacy over time. So this is really a work in process, and I think that's a challenge for, in my opinion, a lot of companies are looking at GDPR as year 2000, so they are doing a paperwork, they are doing on paper the data inventory.
Yeah.
And
check compliance.
Check, yeah. And on 1 month after, they will implement a new system and all their work would be over because they are not maintaining it. So it's very important that company establish a control. Because I mentioned it's all about accountability, and so you need to be accountable of the data that you have. And so this is something that is day-to-day exercise that is very operational. It might be the people at your HR department that at some point put some inappropriate data into your system, and then you're not compliant.
So everybody needs to be a part of it, not just the data protection officer and that kind of thing. Well, speaking of that, what kind of people we have, what kind of people do you typically consult with? Is it technical people? Is it lawyers? Or what kind of... Because one challenge I see is with the customers that I deal with, a lawyer is faced with the task of determining something highly technical. Is this feasible or not? Yeah. If you ask a lawyer, or a lawyer rather, asks you, is this anonymized? And you're like, that depends what you mean. It probably is, but maybe there's a technology that could de-anonymize it and that kind. So how should lawyers handle this highly technical field? Do they need to be highly technical themselves? And how do you see that play out in practice? Who do you deal with typically when working with this? So
Talend is really about taking hands-on on the data. So it's more the people that are manipulating the data, more than the lawyers. But what we see is that this is really a team game. So there needs to be a big lawyer legal perspective. We discuss personal data. Is it personal data? Is it not? So this is a legal decision. You need to have the customer relationship, the marketing on board. And you need to have all the data professionals, so which is already a team game. So people are in IT, people are on the office of the chief data officer, people might be at the operations. And so you need to bring those people all together and you need to educate them. Because today, what is interesting in private data, when you think about your data subjects, you see GDPR, you see, well, finally. So you feel that it's a progress for you as an individual. But for a company, it's more difficult for company to understand the importance and to put all the controls in place. And so everybody within the company should understand the risk, and because this is an opportunity, by the way, because GDPR tells that 4% of your company revenue is linked to data privacy. So this is an important topic. and everybody within the company should participate.
So, do you, with regards to the risk, is the risk great? And do you think that the European Commission and others will be actively seeking out to make sure that people are compliant, or how do you think it will play out in practice?
Yeah. I would think that the risk is a lot linked to your customer relationship.
Okay.
Will your customer, do you think that today customers are already thinking of sending you an email on the 25th of May saying, okay, what is the data that you have about me? Can you bring the electronic version? Can I be forgotten? So how many people will ask for that, or your employee? Or I think companies should think it that way. And then there's a risk if there's a lot of people that ask for it and they are totally unable to answer, then there's a big problem.
Right. So a security person would ask themselves, what is the repercussion? How likely is it that it's going to happen? And how much work is it to mitigate this?
Yeah.
And it seems that the likelihood of it happening is quite high. It doesn't take much for one customer to ask for their data and be dissatisfied if you are not very transparent.
Yeah, I think if you're really a data-driven company, you have started to leverage your customer and your employee data.
Right.
So then GDPR is a big thing, because that means that you might have started to do things but without the controls.
Right.
And you need to establish the controls. And that's why I say that it's an opportunity, because it's the regulation mandates that. So if you're a data professional, it's the opportunity to go to the CFO or to go to the execs and say, okay, this is important. We need to establish the control.
Right.
Because all this data has a lot of value, but because it has a lot of value, if we lose them,
reliable,
it can have a lot of costs, of risks, and things like that. Like your home, the more you have goods in your home, the more you have risk to for burglars to come in your home. yeah.
But the companies that are doing well, among the ones that you're consulting with, what would you say are the top two things that they are doing correctly that has enabled them to smoothly transition into GDPR with confidence? I was thinking, you said you need to bring people together. Are people building V teams? What kind of things are they doing?
Yeah, establish a kind of governance team. Have this governance team bringing the different operation on board, doing a lot of training, and then implementing some system to really get hands-on the data. So, as I say,
are there tools that they should be using? Specific tools?
Things like master data management, things like metadata management to get lineage of the data. So, of course, tools like instead of bringing data into Excel, tools that can track and trace what is. So, tools that brings transparency.
So just add another reason to not use little personal reports that you send to each other anymore.
Yeah,
seems like a thing of the past.
When you look at the data breach, some of them, one is Sony. If you go to WikiLeaks and you search Sony WikiLeaks, then you can find a lot of personal data that were in Excel, and it was not, the leak was not breaking out the SAP or Salesforce. It was just taking all the reports that were spread out across the file systems. And here you can see the wages of the actors, or so that's where the sensitive data were.
I have a question here from one of the delegates. How will GDPR change targeting in campaigns? And I think it doesn't necessarily have to be an e-tailer or something like that. Consider even Spotify. You know, people listening to music. You can probably tell quite a lot about a person based on the different things that they've listed in music. They get recommendations. Maybe Spotify needs to be accountable for what their algorithms recommend to the users. But how do you think that recommendations and personalization will be affected? Do you think it will go down?
No, I don't. So GDPR, I think we do privacy because we want to personalize. So and there's nothing that makes you stop that.
Right. What about the algorithms that recommend if you need to be accountable for why I got this dress recommended to me or something?
So you need to have transparency with your customer. So when you take personal data, the customer needs to understand why, the benefits, and sometimes how does it work. If it's sensitive, how does it work? There is a recent example. I think it's Netflix or so. A social media guy at Netflix published statistics saying that some of their customers were listening the same program every time, and it was very badly perceived because Netflix customer know that they give a lot of data to Netflix.
Right.
But if this data is used for other things, that recommending the best film, if it's used for selling to a third party or publishing it in social network, then the trust is broken with your customer. Right. So you can go very far in personalizing data. I've heard that Amazon is even trying to has bought a company to be able to enter into your home.
Yes.
To do your shipment securely.
Yes, it's very neat.
So you need to trust Amazon to let them enter into your home.
Yes.
Just to put a shipment.
Yeah.
So you need so that's very. If Amazon don't have the trust, nobody would let you enter. So that's very important to have. We have in France. There is an interesting thing for utilities. So they are trying to implement smart meters into home. And the national company were very bad at explaining the benefit for the customer.
Right.
And currently customers are not opening the door to this company to have the smart meters in their home. They don't want those smart meters. And there's a kind of boycott that is getting it. And it's because there's no trust.
Right.
If customers understand why it's needed, that it won't hurt their private life, and that they get benefits, why would they close the door?
Right.
And that's the kind of system of trust that companies need to implement. I want to be clear that those is not about breaking personalization. The personalization principle is very important, but you have to do it in a fair and transparent way.
Right. So let's see. We had one more question here that I thought was particularly neat. Oh yes, which vendors can support GDPR? So I've seen a lot of vendors, cloud vendors and others, saying that we are 100% GDPR ready, GDPR compliant. Our tool is GDPR certified, maybe that kind of thing. What do those things mean? And what advantage is there to going with a vendor that perhaps is GDPR ready?
Yeah. So you need to consider two things. As a vendor could have information about you as a person. So that's we are data controllers. So at Talend we have a marketing database, we have a customer database, we even have our own cloud applications. I will come back to the cloud dimension, but so we are a company that manage customer data, and for that we need to comply. I won't say that we are the best, the deepest examples, because we don't manage location data, we don't manage data when you are at night in a club. So so B2B is pretty simple in terms of GDPR compliance. So that's the first thing. And we need to comply, but I think we are not the best. So if I take my customers, the banks or the transportation company, do most complex things in terms of privacy that we need to do.
Right.
Then there's a second thing, which is us as cloud providers. And we have more and more our software. You are always on connected. You can know everything what our user is doing with our software, and we are hosting data in different parts of the world.
Right.
And then so it's called being a data processor. And so for that, we can say, okay, we comply with the regulation as a company that is processing data. So you have to separate the two things.
Right.
I think the us as data controller is not so important for other customer. We need to comply as any company, but our use case is not more important than others. But as data processors, of course, company when they contract with a software vendor that is doing data on the cloud, they need to understand how the personal data is managed,
Right.
how we can react if there is a leak or things like that.
So it's often more than one company that's handling data, like you just said now, and I think it's important to remember who is liable in case something were to happen.
Yeah.
So you usually outsource your IT, even your entire IT department, or other things like that. And who in the end is liable? To be clear,
The one that captures the data that needs to control the
the one
data.
that captured it.
So when Talend asks your email for a marketing campaign, it might be that we put it in a cloud environment, or it might be that we sell it to another company or whatever. We are accountable. And that's what is very different, by the way, with US company. So if you look at some recent kind of breach scandals, one was interesting. It was Equifax. So the principle is, so if you own a credit card in US, your bank will give the data to Equifax.
Right.
And then Equifax will do scoring, and Equifax will also sell your data to others. With regulation like GDPR, ultimately it's the bank who is responsible, because the bank gave the data to Equifax.
Right.
And so the bank should be responsible, should maybe have controls to make sure that Equifax doesn't sell the data. So it's the bank. And this is very important to understand.
Creates a hierarchy of accountability that's more foolproof.
Yeah.
All right.
From a personal data subject perspective, this is important, because in US, so people like you and me cannot go to Equifax and say, ask for indemnities to Equifax, because they never gave the data to Equifax.
Right.
Their bank did.
Right. We have a minute or two left, and I'd like to know, in your opinion, the most practical thing a company can do to get ready for GDPR. And we all know everybody's talking to their lawyers, trying to figure out how we can get the right to be forgotten correct, and all those kinds of things. What would you think? What do you think it should be top of mind right now in practice?
Take the shoes of your customer and imagine what the customer would like to do on the 25th of May and how you will process it. So when he'll knock on your door, ask for your data, how will you manage that? How would you be able to give the data to them? Would it be a simple thing for the customer? Would it be a kind of portal? Or would it be an email to the legal department and a panic within the organization to say, how can we reconcile the data? So I think this is very practical, because...
so maybe running through that process in practice. Yeah,
and if you look, you can go to the web and just try it. If you today, you can ask your data to LinkedIn, for example, and you receive it immediately. Try to do the same to your bank or to your telco company. It's more tricky. And so the question is, will you as a company be ready when there's a lot of customers that just ask that and consider that it's a customer service that you need to deliver to them?
All right. Thank you very much for being here.